Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is again the next 40 or so pages. It'll be about 1 to 1.5 chapters of Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Societies by Noam Chomsky. We talked yesterday about the U.S. government. It's media, it's propaganda. It is an authoritarian media. It is a fascist type of media. It is not a democratic media system. The Western, propagandists, the Western colonialism, has instituted a propaganda sort of thought control. Their imperial ambitions, the British, the French, and the Americans, allows them to introduce thought control and, imperial ambitions. Just an individual who gets murdered, someone who gets murdered in the pursuit of colonialism isn't murdered, actually. It's, the Western governments say that, the paranoia is allowed in the form of, murder, of, subversive. Whoever they don't trust, they believe that we can murder them with impunity. And then the Western colonialists get together with their media and institute a form of thought control. So no one knows, what actually happens. They yell really loud. They have a big voice in the world. And since they are, propagandists, liars, fabricators, falsifiers, omitters, and, deliberate, liars, you get a media that is associated with poor form and poor truth. It is a truth averting media. It is a propagandist media. And, this podcast is mainly about the American media. What has been extrapolated with the American media is that it is a fascist form of thought control. It is a fascist, fraudulent media. It is a racist media that, is pro-colonialist. The New York Times has been deemed as pro-colonialist by Dr. Chomsky, and they have been deemed racist by Dr. Chomsky. And that is key. That is clear, when you read the Times article and you read his analysis. The New York Times is racist. The Washington Post is racist. Newsweek and Reader's Digest are racist media outlets. And just like that, you have the Western colonialists having their own racist media outlets. So it forms a sort of, imperialist media. They're, obsessed with imperialism, obsessed with colonialism, and obsessed with slavery of third world peoples. So we're going to, go through a little bit about why the media is the way it is. We have a capitalist elite group. The capitalist elite group is responsible for what the media says. So the capitalist elite put out their statements. It is not fact-checked. It is not questioned. And boom, it goes out. The capitalist elite form the businesses that report to the U.S. Congress. The businesses report to the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress issued its edicts in the media, and that forms the propaganda or the show that the U.S. government calls a democracy, which is actually a fascist elite media. And, the capitalist elite statements go out, and if anyone dissents against that statement, it is the Congress's responsibility to murder them and ensure that they don't speak. The second thing is it's a propaganda. Propaganda means it is something meant for state government, for government purposes. It is meant to, and portray the government in the most positive light, in the most, innocent light, all of which are fraud. It is all fraud. America is a guilty state. It is a guilty state of racist, murderers. And, it's all fraud. This is all fraud and propaganda. But the concept of propaganda is simply a government, issuing media or issuing, information in the form of, basically the government is good. The government is innocent. The government is good. The government is doing good things. It's liberating people. All, fraud. This is all fraud. And then there's deception and thought control. The U.S. government's media is meant to deceive and to control people's thoughts. It is meant to instill small pieces of thought, small suggestions so that you don't really see the bigger picture. They say that, oh, well, there's, a big, bloodbath, it's like a big, a European bloodbath in America. And everybody goes around and says that, oh, the whites are always killing each other and stuff. But actually the whites are killing the blacks. They're killing the Hispanics. They're killing the Mexicans. They're killing the Asians. That is what they do. They, put this big, show as if, it's just a general people violence, but it's actually directed racist violence against individual communities like Asians, blacks, and Hispanics. And that's a huge thing to understand, that thought control, or grouping everything into like this big generalization as if it doesn't mean anything, is a key to their media deception campaign. And we speak about El Salvador, Indochina, Nicaragua, and Brazil in their in Dr. Chomsky's book with respect to necessary illusions and thought control. So I'm going to just read some background. The Google Drive link will be in the description section. Please download it. We discussed 2 chapters of Chomsky's book, Democracy in the Media and Containing the Enemy, yesterday. Dr. Chomsky describes the U.S. media as a fascist authoritarian media, similar to Nazi Germany and Hitler's media, as well as Stalin's Russian media. There is no room for free speech or open discussion. It simply is an elite white capitalist American and Western European who decides the direction of the country, both domestically and militarily. Of course, it is fascist and highly racist, and this is proven by the thought control that the media displays in its propaganda machinations that it makes with respect to international conflict, especially. In Chapter 1, we discussed the U.S. government's suppression of the media through delusions that the media is anti-government and anti-American when they discuss any matter with respect to America that provides a critical scholarly analysis. The racist American government promotes ideas of American innocence and American liberation of third world when there is the message of American guilt and shame for criminal terrorist acts and enslavement pursuits of the third world peoples. We also discussed in Chapter 2 an example of the U.S. government depiction of American innocence in El Salvador. When Napoleon Gonzalez, operator of the only independent press in El Salvador that was not government of El Salvador, pleaded with the United States and New York not to destroy his paper he had worked hard in and was needing to discuss American atrocities in El Salvador, the U.S. machine-gunned his office and murdered him. Bombs were planted in his newspaper outlet and its press was destroyed, and he was hunted down by the U.S. government, terrorist whites of Washington, and murdered with machine gun fire. When asked what happened, the U.S. denied responsibility, since they will never pay reparations for murder by the American terrorist government. We also discussed in Chapter 2, Containing the Enemy, about Agent Orange. The U.S. government committed war crimes against the Indo-Chinese people through Agent Orange, a toxic chemical warfare agent and defoliant that was used generously against the third world peoples of Indochina. The racist white American murderous butchers created medical malformations, including deformed babies, thousands of cancers, fetal retardation, and tried to create a group of retards in Indochina using chemical warfare. As we know, they are a terrorist international group of gangsters, and racist third world murder is their specialty. It is necessary to explore 2 new chapters, Bounds of the Expressible and Adjuncts of Government, in understanding the danger of the American totalitarian and fascist media. So let's get started. Chapter 3, Bounds of the Expressible. While negotiating that there is rarely anything strictly new under the sun, still we can identify some moments when traditional ideas are reshaped, a new consciousness crystallizes, and the opportunities that lie ahead appear in a new light. Fabrications of necessary illusions for social management is as old as history, but the year 1917 might be seen as a transition point in the modern period. The Bolshevik Revolution gave concrete expression to the Leninist conception of the radical intelligentsia as the vanguard of social progress, exploiting popular struggles to gain state power and to pose the rule of the red bureaucracy of Bakunin's forebodings. This they proceeded at once to do, dismantling factory councils, Soviets, and other form of popular organization, so that the population could be effectively mobilized into a labor army under the control of far-sighted leaders who would drive the society forward, with the best intentions, of course, to this end. The mechanism of Agertrop, or fundamental, even a totalitarian state of Hitler or Stalin variety, relies on mass mobilization and voluntary submission. One notable doctrine of Soviet propaganda is that the elimination by Lenin and Trotsky of any vestige of control over production by producers and of popular involvement in determining social policy constitutes a triumph of socialism. The purpose of this exercise in newspeak is to exploit the moral appeal of the ideals that were being successfully demolished. Western propaganda leaped to the same opportunity, identifying the dismantling of socialist forms as the establishment of socialism, so as to undermine left libertarian ideals by associating them with the practices of the grim red bureaucracy. To this day, both systems of propaganda adopt the terminology for their different purposes. When both major world systems of propaganda are in accord, it is unusually difficult for the individual to escape their tentacles. The blow to freedom and democracy throughout the world has been immense. In the same year, 1917, John Dewey's circle of liberal pragmatists took credit for guiding a pacifist population to war under the influence of a moral verdict reached after the utmost deliberation by the more thoughtful members of the community, a class which must comprehensively be but loosely described as the intellectuals, who they held had accomplished the effective and decisive work on behalf of the war. This achievement, or at least the self-perception articulated, had broad consequences. Dewey, the intellectual mentor, explained that this psychological and educational lesson had proven that it is possible for human beings to take hold of human affairs and manage them. The human beings who had learned the lesson were intelligent men of the community. Lippmann's specialized class, Niebuhr's cool observers. They must now apply their talents and understanding to bring about a better recognized social order by planning, persuasion, or force where necessary. But, Dewey insisted, only the refined, subtle, and indirect use of force, not the coarse of obvious and direct methods employed prior to the advance of knowledge. The sophisticated resort to force is justified if it satisfies the requirement of comparative efficiency and economy in its use. The newly articulated doctrines of manufacture of consent were a natural concomitant, and in 3 years we were to hear much of the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals who transcend ideology and will solve the remaining social problems by rational application of scientific principles. Since that time, the main body of articulate intellectuals have tended towards one or the other of these poles, avoiding democratic dogmatisms about people, understanding their own interests, and remaining cognizant of the stupidity of the average man and his need to be led to the better world that his superior plan has for him. A move from one to the other pole can be quite rapid and painless, since no fundamental change of doctrine or value is at stake, only an assessment of the opportunities for attaining power and privilege, riding a wave of popular struggle, or serving established authority as social or ideologic manager. The conventional God that failed transition from Leninist enthusiasms to service to state capitalism can, I believe, be explained in substantial measure in these terms. Though there were authentic elements in the early stages, it has long since degenerated to ritualistic farce. Particularly welcome and a sure ticket to success is the fabrication of an evil past. Thus, the confessed sinner might describe how he cheered the tanks in the streets of Prague, supported Kim Il-sung, denounced Martin Luther King as a sellout, and so on, so that those who have not seen the light are implicitly tarred with the brush. With the transition accomplished, the path to prestige and privilege is open, for the system values highly those who have seen the error in their ways and can now condemn independent minds as Stalinist-style apologists on the basis of superior insight gained from their misspent youth. Some may choose to become experts in the style candidly articulated by Henry Kissinger, who defined the expert as a person skilled in elaborating and defining the consensus of his constituency. Those who have vested interest in commonly held opinions, elaborating and defining its consensus at a high level has, after all, made him an expert. A generation later, the United States and the Soviet Union had become the superpowers of the first truly global system, realizing the expectations of Alexander Herzen and others a century before. Though the dimensions of their power were never comparable, and both have been declining in their capacity to influence and coerce for some years. The two models of the role of the intellectuals persist, similar at their root, adapted to the two prevailing systems of hierarchy and domination. Correspondingly, systems of indoctrination vary depending on the capacity of the state to coerce and the modalities of effective control. The more interesting system is that of capitalist democracy, relying on the free market, guided by direct intervention where necessary, to establish conformity and marginalize the special interests. The primary targets of the manufacture of consent are those who regard themselves as the more thoughtful members of the community, the intellectuals, the opinion leaders. An official of the Truman administration remarked that it doesn't make too much difference to the general public what the details of a program are. What counts is how the plan is viewed by the leaders of the community. He who mobilizes the elite mobilizes the public, one scholarly study of public opinion concludes. The public opinion that Truman and his advisors took seriously and diligently sought to cultivate was that of the elite of opinion leaders, the foreign policy public. Diplomatic historian Thomas Patterson observes, and the same is true consistently, apart from the moments when a crisis of democracy must be overcome and more vigorous measures are required to relegate the general public to its proper place. At other times, they can be satisfied, it is hoped, with diversions at a regular dose regular dose of patriotic propaganda and fulminations against enemies who endanger their lives and homes unless their leaders stand fast against the threat. In the democratic system, the necessary illusions cannot be imposed by force. Rather, they must be instilled in the public mind by more subtle means. A totalitarian state can be satisfied with lesser degrees of allegiance to required truths. It is sufficient that people obey what they think is a secondary concern. But in a democratic political order, there is always the danger that independent thought might be translated into political action. So it is important to eliminate the threat at its root. Debate cannot be stilled, and indeed, in a properly functioning system of propaganda, it should not be, because it has a system reinforcing character of constraint within proper bounds. What is essential is to set the bounds firmly. Controversy may rage as long as it adheres to the presuppositions that define the consensus of elites, and it should furthermore be encouraged within these bounds, thus helping to establish these doctrines as the very condition of thinkable thought while reinforcing the belief that freedom reigns. In short, what is essential to the power is the power to set the agenda. If controversy over Cold War can be focused on containment of the Soviet Union, the proper mix of force, diplomacy, and other measures, when the propaganda system has already won its victory, whatever the conclusions are reached. The basic assumption has already been established. The Cold War is a confrontation between two superpowers, one aggressive and expansionist, the other defending the status quo and civilized values. Off the agenda is the problem of containing the United States and the question whether the issue has been properly formulated at all, whether the Cold War does not rather derive from the efforts of superpowers to secure for themselves international systems that they can dominate and control. Systems that differ greatly in scale, reflecting enormous differences in wealth and power. Soviet violations of the Yalta and Potsdam agreements are the topic of a large literature and are well established in the general consciousness. We then proceed to debate their scale and importance, but it would require a careful search to find discussions of U.S. violations of the wartime agreements and their consequences, though the judgment of the best current scholarship years later is, in fact, the Soviet pattern of adherence to Yalta, Potsdam, and other wartime agreements was not qualitatively different from the American pattern. If the agenda can be restricted to the ambiguities of Arafat, the abuses and failures of the Sandinistas, the terrorism of Iran and Libya, and the properly framed issues, then the game is basically over. Excluded from discussion is the unambiguous rejectionism of the United States and Israel and the terrorists and other crimes of the United States and its clients, not only far greater in scale, but also incomparably more significant on any moral dimension for American citizens who are in the position to mitigate or terminate these crimes. The same consideration holds whatever questions we address. One crucial doctrine, standard throughout history, is that the state is adopting a defensive stance, resisting challenges to order and to its noble principle. Thus, the United States is invariably resisting aggression, sometimes internal aggression. Leading scholars assure us that the war in Vietnam was undertaken in defense of a free people resisting communist aggression, as the United States attacked South Vietnam in the early 1960s to defend the client dictatorship against the South Vietnamese aggressors who were about to overthrow it. No justification need to be offered to establish such an obvious truth, and none is. Some even refer blandly to the Eisenhower administration's strategy of deterring aggression by threatening the use of nuclear weapons in Indochina in 1954, where French forces found themselves facing defeat in Dien Bien Phu at the hands of the communist Viet Minh, the aggressors who attacked our French ally, defending Indochina from its own population. Cultivated opinion generally has internalized this stance. Accordingly, it is a logical impossibility that one should oppose U.S. aggression, a category that cannot exist. Whatever pretense they adopt, the critics must be partisans of Hanoi or apologists of communism elsewhere defending the aggressors, perhaps attempting to conceal their hidden agendas. A related doctrine is that the yearning to see American-style democracy duplicated throughout the world has been a persistent theme in American foreign policy, as a New York Times diplomatic correspondent proclaimed after a U.S.-backed military government suppressed the Haitian elections by violence, widely predicted to be the likely consequence of U.S. support for the junta. These sad events, he observed, are the latest reminder of the difficulty American policymakers face in trying to work their will, no matter how benevolent, are on other nations. The doctrines require no argument to resist mountains of counter-evidence. On occasion, the pretense collapses under its manifest absurdity. It is then permissible to recognize that we were not always so benevolent and so profoundly dedicated to democracy as we are today. The regular appeal to this convenient technique of change of course over many years elicits not ridicule, but odes to our unfailing benevolence as we've set forth on some new campaign to quote unquote defend democracy. We have no problem in perceiving the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as brutal aggression, though many would balk at describing the Afghan guerrillas as a democratic resistance forces. New Republic editor Andrew Sullivan. But the U.S. invasion of South Vietnam in the early 1960s, when the Latin American-style terror state imposed by U.S. force could no longer control the domestic population by violence, cannot be perceived as what it was. True, U.S. forces were directly engaged in large-scale bombing and defoliation in an effort to drive the population into concentration camps where they could be protected from the enemy whom, it was concluded, they willingly supported. True, a huge U.S. expeditionary force later invaded and ravaged the country and its neighbors with the explicit aim of destroying what was clearly recognized to be the only mass-based political force and eliminating the danger of political settlement that was sought on all sides. But throughout, the United States was resisting aggression in its yearning for democracy. When the United States established the murderous Diem dictatorship as part of its effort to undermine the Geneva Accords and to block the promised elections because the wrong side was expected to win, it was defending democracy. The country is divided into the communist regime in the north and a democratic government in the south, the New York Times reported, commenting on the allegation that the communist Viet Minh was importing guns and soldiers from Red China in the most blatant fashion, threatening free Vietnam after having sold their country to Peiping. In later years, as the defense of democracy went awry, there was vigorous debate between the hawks who felt that with sufficient dedication, the enemy could be demolished, and the doves who feared that the resort to violence to attain our noble ends might prove too costly. Some preferred to be owls, distancing themselves from the two extremes. Throughout the war, it was taken for granted within the mainstream that the United States was defending South Vietnam. Unwisely, the Doves came to believe years later the doctrine remains beyond challenge. This is not only true of those who parodied the most disgraceful commissars as atrocities mounted, seeing nothing more in saturation bombing of densely populated areas than the unfortunate loss of life incurred by the efforts of American military forces to help the South Vietnamese repel the incursion of North Vietnam and its partisans. For example, in the Mekong Delta, where there were no North Vietnamese troops, even long after the United States had expanded its aggression to North Vietnam, and where local people resisting the U.S. invaders and their clients evidently do not qualify as South Vietnamese. It is perhaps surprising that from such sources, we should still read today, with all that is now known, that the people of South Vietnam desired their freedom from domination by the communist country on their northern border, and that the United States intervened in Vietnam to establish the principle that changes in Asia were not to be precipitated by outside force. Far more interesting is the fact that even though many would be repelled by the vulgarity of the apologetics for large-scale atrocities, a great many educated people would find little surprising in this assessment of the history, a most remarkable demonstration of the effectiveness of democratic systems of thought control. Similarly, in Central America today, the United States is dedicated to defense of freedom in the fledgling democracies and to restoring democracy to Nicaragua, a reference to the Somoza period, if words have meaning. At the extreme of expressible dissent is in a bitter condemnation of the U.S. attack on Nicaragua that went so far as to invoke the judgment of Nuremberg. Atlantic Monthly editor Jack Peedy wrote that democracy has been our goal in Nicaragua, and to reach it, we have sponsored the killing of thousands of Nicaraguans. But killing for democracy, even killing by proxy for democracy, is not a good enough reason to prosecute a war. One could hardly find a more consistent critic of the U.S. war in the corporate media than columnist Tom Wicker of the New York Times, who condemned the application of the Reagan Doctrine to Nicaragua because the United States has no historic or God-given right to bring democracy to other nations. Critics adopt without a second thought the assumption that our traditional yearning for democracy has indeed guided U.S. policy towards Nicaragua since July 1979, when the U.S. client Somoza was overthrown, though admittedly not before the miraculous and curiously timed transformation took place by some mysterious process. A diligent search through all the media would unearth an occasional exception of this pattern, but such exceptions are rare, another tribute to the effectiveness of the indoctrination. Central America has an evident self-interest in hounding the Sandinistas to honor their pledges to democratize, and those Americans who have repeatedly urged others to give peace a chance now have an obligation to turn their attention to the passion to ensuring democracy a chance as well. The editors of the Washington Post admonish directly below the masthead that proudly labeled, "There's an independent newspaper. There is no problem of ensuring democracy in the U.S.-backed terror states, firmly under military rule behind a thin civilian facade." The same editorial warned that from the incursions into Honduras in March 1988, it is plain what Nicaragua's threats to Honduras are. The reference was to military operations in northern Nicaragua near an unmarked border in which Nicaraguan forces in hot pursuit of Contra invaders penetrated a few kilometers into areas of Honduras that had long been ceded to the U.S. proxy force. as they are described by lobbyists in internal documents circulated in the White House and by their own official spokesman. In the United States, these actions elicited renewed outrage over the threat of the Sandinistas to overrun their neighbors in the service of their Soviet master. The heartfelt concern over the security of borders is most impressive, even if somewhat tainted by the curious conception of a border as a kind of one-way mirror, so that its sanctity is not violated by CIA supply flights to the proxy forces who invade Nicaragua from their Honduran bases, or by U.S. surveillance flights over Nicaraguan territory to guide and direct them, among other crimes. Putting aside these matters, we can assess the seriousness of the concern by turning to the results of a controlled experiment that history obligingly constructed, just at the time when the free press was consumed with the rage over the latest proof of the aggressiveness of the violent communist totalitarians. With major stories and angry commentary, the U.S. client state of Israel launched another series of its periodic operations in Lebanon. These operations were north of the sector of southern Lebanon that Israel has virtually annexed as a security zone, integrating the area with Israel's economy and compelling the 200,000 Lebanese inhabitants to provide soldiers for the South Lebanon Army, an Israel mercenary force, by means of an array of punishments and inducements. The Israeli operations included bombing of Palestinian refugee camps and Lebanese towns and villages with large-scale destruction, dozens killed and many wounded, including many civilians. The operations were barely reported, and there was no noticeable reaction. The only rational conclusion is that the outrage over the vastly less serious and far more justified Nicaraguan incursion was entirely unprincipled, mere fraud. The U.S. government is happy to explain why it supports Israeli violence deep inside Lebanon. The grounds are the sacred, inherent right of self-defense, which may legitimately be invoked by the United States and its clients under quite a broad interpretation, though not, of course, by others, in particular, by victims of U.S. terror. In December 1988, just as Yasser Arafat's every gesture was being closely scrutinized to determine whether he had met the exacting U.S. standards on terrorism, to which we return, Israel launched its 26th raid of the year on Lebanon, attacking a base of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine near Beirut. As is common, there was no attempt to provide a plausible pretext. The Israelis were not in hot pursuit of terrorists, the London Guardian observed, nor did they have their usual excuse of instant vengeance. They just went ahead and staged a demo to prove that the Iron Fist is in full working order. The motive for the demonstration was obviously a show of strength. This spectacular display, complete with paratroops, helicopters, and gunboats, was a military unjustifiable and therefore politically motivated combined operation. The timing explains the political motivation. The raid was carried out on the first anniversary of the outbreak of the Palestinian uprising in the occupied territories, where Israel imposed a massive military presence, a curfew, and strict censorship to block a commemorative strike. In addition to this obvious political motivation, one may also discern a calculated attempt to undermine Mr. Arafat and his welcome moves toward political accommodation by strengthening the hand of the militants within the PLO. The Israeli attack was brought to the UN Security Council, which voted 14-1 with no abstentions for a resolution that strongly deplored it. Ambassador Patricia Byrne justified the U.S. veto on the grounds that the resolution would deny to Israel its inherent right to defend itself from attacks and reprisals that have originated on the other side of the border. A fortiori, Nicaragua is entitled to carry out massive and regular attacks deep inside Honduras and indeed to set off bombs in Washington. Note that such actions would be far more justified than those in the United States, those that the United States defends in the case of its client, as is obvious from the comparison of the level of provocation. Needless to say, the truth is inexpressible, indeed unthinkable. We therefore conclude that the media commentary concerning Nicaragua is just as racist and hypocritical as the pretense of state authorities, for whom one expects nothing else. The absence of comment on the Israeli actions or even serious reporting is perhaps understandable. These options were, after all, rather muted by Israeli standards. Thus, they did not compare with the murderous Iron Fist operations in Lebanon in 1985, or the murderous or the bombing of villages in the Bekaa Valley in January 1984, with 100 killed and 400 wounded in one raid, mostly civilians, including 150 children in a bombed-out schoolhouse, or an attack on the UNRWA school in Damour in May 1979 by an Israeli F-16 that dropped cluster bombs, leaving 41 children dead or wounded. These were reported but without affecting the elevated status of this tiny nation, symbol of human decency, as the editors of the New York Times described Israel during a peak period of the repression of the Palestinian uprising with beatings, killings, gassing, and collective punishment. A country that cares for human life, in the admiring words of the Washington Post editors, in the wake of the Iron Fist atrocities. The fact that Israel maintains a security zone in southern Lebanon, controlled by a terrorist mercenary army backed by Israeli might, also pass without notice, as does Israel's regular hijacking of ships in international waters and other actions that are rarely even reported and might perhaps arouse a whisper of protest in the case of worthy victims. If Soviet Jews were to suffer the treatment meted out regularly to Arabs, or if some official enemy such as Nicaragua were to impose repressive measures approaching those that are standard in this symbol of human decency, the outcry would be deafening. I will return to some further observations on the extraordinary protection the media have provided Israel, while depicting its enemies, particularly the PLO, as evil incarnate, committed only to terror and destruction, and to the remarkable feats of historical engineering that have been performed year by year to maintain the required image. During Israel's March 1988 operations, there was no question of hot pursuit, and Israel is not an impoverished country attempting to survive the terrorist attack of a superpower and its lethal economic warfare. But Israel is a U.S. client and therefore inherits the right of aggression. Nicaragua, in contrast, is denied the right even to drive attacking forces out of its own territory on the tacit assumption that no state has the right to define itself from a racist U.S. attack, another crucial doctrine that underlies responsible debate. It is remarkable to see how deeply the latter doctrine is entrenched. Thus, nothing arouses greater hysteria in the United States than reports that Nicaragua is planning to obtain MiG fighters. When the Reaganites floated such reports as part of the campaign to eliminate the minimal danger of honest reporting of the unwanted Nicaraguan elections in November 1984, even outspoken doves warned that the U.S. would have to bomb Nicaragua to destroy the invented MiGs because they're also capable against the United States, a dire threat to our security, Massachusetts Senator Paul Tsongas said. In another propaganda coup of December 1987, a Sandinista defector was produced with elaborate accompanying fanfare in the media on his revelations about Sandinista intentions, the most stunning of which was that Nicaragua was hoping to obtain jet planes to defend its territory from U.S. attack and intolerable outrage. It is, of course, well understood that Nicaragua has no other way to prevent the CIA from supplying the forces it directs within Nicaragua or to interfere with the U.S. surveillance flights to provide these forces with up-to-the-minute intelligence on Nicaraguan troop deployments so that they could safely attack soft targets, barely defend civilian targets in accord with Pentagon and State Department directives. But no such reflection disturbed the display of indignation over this latest proof of communist aggressiveness. The logic is clear. Nicaragua has no right of self-defense. It is intolerable, tantamount to aggression, for Nicaragua to interfere with U.S. violence and terror by presuming to protect its airspace, or by defending the population against the racist U.S. proxy forces, the democratic resistance, or public rhetoric. For the same reason, the report by the Sandinista defector that the Nicaragua intended to reduce its military forces while providing light arms to the population for defense against a possible U.S. invasion elicited further outrage as it was transmitted by the free press into a threat to conquer the hemisphere. The doctrine of the elite consensus is again highly revealing, as is the fact that its meaning cannot be perceived. We might imagine the reaction of if the Soviet Union were to respond in a similar way to the far more serious threat to its security posed by Denmark or Luxembourg. It is interesting that in the midst of the furor over the Sandinista plans to obtain means to defend themselves, the United States began shipping advanced F-5 jet planes to Honduras on December 15, 1987. Unreported by the New York Times, since only the United States and its allies have security concerns, obviously Nicaragua could have no legitimate objection to this development, and it would be superfluous, surely, to report the protests in the Honduran press over the debts unfairly imposed upon us by pressure from the United States that force us to pay the bill for F-5 fighters that do nothing to feed our hungry people, though they please the military rulers. One might ask why Nicaragua was so intent on obtaining Soviet planes. Why not French Mirage jets instead? In fact, the Sandinistas would have been quite happy to obtain jet interceptors from France and openly say so, though they could not because U.S. pressure had blocked supply from any non-communist source. All of this is unreportable because it would give the game away. Thus, Stephen Kinzer and James Lemoyne of the New York Times would never disturb their efforts to fan hysteria over the Sandinistas' threat by reporting such facts, nor would they dwell on the reasons why the Sandinistas might be attempting to obtain jet interceptors. Such inquiry escapes the bounds of propriety, for it would undermine the campaign to portray U.S. aggression and racist terror as legitimate defense. The point is more general. Attacks against those designated communists will normally compel them to rely on the Soviet Union for defense, particularly when the United States pressures its allies and international lending institutions to refrain from offering assistance, as in the case of contemporary Nicaragua, where it was clear enough in early 1981 that Nicaragua will sooner or later become another Soviet client as the U.S. imposes a stranglehold on its reconstruction and development, rebuffs efforts to maintain decent relations, and supports harassment and intervention, the pattern of China, Cuba, Guatemala, Arbenz, Allende's Chile, Vietnam in the 1940s and the post-1975 period, etc. This predictable consequence of policy can then be taken as retrospective proof that we are indeed simply engaged in defense against the Kremlin design for world conquest, and well-behaved journalists may refer to the Soviet-supplied Sandinistas in properly ominous tones, as they regularly do, carefully avoiding the reasons. An additional benefit is that we now test the sincerity of the Soviet Union in their profession about detente, asking whether they will withhold aid from Nicaragua if we reduce aid to the Contras. The idea that U.S. sincerity could be tested by withholding aid from Turkey or El Salvador is too outlandish to merit discussion. A corollary to the principle that official enemies do not have the right of self-defense is that if Nicaragua attacks Contra forces within its territory after the break-off negotiations, the United States plainly has the right to provide further military aid to its proxies. The Byrd Amendment on assistance for the Nicaraguan resistance, passed in August 1988 with the effusive support of leading senatorial doves, permitted military aid to the proxy forces within Nicaragua upon Sandinista initiation of an unprovoked military attack and any other hostile action directed against the forces of the Nicaraguan resistance, or a continued unacceptable level of military assistance by Soviet bloc countries, including Cuba. All other sources have been barred, and U.S. authorities being accorded the right to determine what is acceptable. The media has taken for granted throughout that it would be outrageous, another display of communist intransigence, if the army of Nicaragua were to attack terrorist forces within their own country. Months earlier, the press had reported a letter by House Democrats to President Ortega expressing their grave concern over the possibility of a military offensive against the Contras, which would lead to a consideration of a renewal of military aid to the state resistance forces. The prohibition against self-defense remained in force after the U.S. clients and undermined negotiations with last-minute demands contrived to this end, to which we return. The media reaction is understandable on the conventional assumption that the resistance and the political opposition that supports it within Nicaragua are the more legitimate of the two Nicaraguan factions, as the Times describes the Contras and the government. The bipartisan consensus on these matters, including outspoken congressional doves, reflects the understanding that Nicaragua has no right to resist U.S. terrorist forces implanted in its territory or attacking it from abroad. U.S. clients are immune from such constraints and may even hijack ships, bomb civilian targets in other countries, and so on, in legitimate self-defense. The August 5th Senate debate on the Byrd Amendment gains heightened significance from its timing. 3 days earlier, the resistance, after allowing an Army patrol boat to pass by, had attacked the crowded passenger vessel Mission of Peace, killing 2 people and wounding 27, including a Baptist minister from New Jersey, Reverend Lucius Walker, who headed a U.S. religious delegation. All the victims were civilians. Senator Burton Dodd and other doves who bitterly condemned the Sandinistas while praising the courageous leadership of the Democratic presidents of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Democratic. Made no mention of this event. Perhaps they had missed the tiny notice it received the day before the New York Times tacked onto a column reporting their deliberations. There was no subsequent commentary. The logic is again clear. If the Sandinistas seek to root out U.S.-run terrorists who carried out the attack, that proves they are communist totalitarians, and the United States is entitled to send military as well as humanitarian and aid to the resistance so that it can pursue such tasks more effectively, given the enthusiastic support for this Senate proceedings by the Senate's leading liberal voices, Harkin, Kennedy, Kerry, Mitchell, Pell, and others. We may assume that they accept these principles. It is frankly recognized that the principal argument for terrorist U.S. violence is that a longer war of attrition will so weaken the regime, provoke such a radical hardening of repression, and win sufficient support from Nicaragua's discontented population that sooner or later the regime will be overthrown by popular vote, self-destruct by means of internal coups or leadership splits, or simply capitulate to salvage what it can. The formulation of Viran Vaki, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs under the Carter administration, merely reiterates the thrust of the 1981 CIA program outlined by CIA analyst David McMichael in World Court testimony. As a dove, Vaki regards the scenario as flawed and the strategy unworkable, the Contras having been unable to gain military successes despite the extraordinary advantages conferred upon them by their sponsor, or to elicit significant political support within Nicaragua. However reasonable or idealistic the U.S. demand that the Sandinistas turn over power to U.S. favorites lacking political support, he continues, the goal is beyond our reach. He therefore urges positive containment instead of rollback to prevent Nicaragua's from posing a military threat to the United States and to induce it to observe human rights and a move toward a less virulent internal system. Since force is not feasible, the United States should seek other strategies to pursue the objective of promoting Nicaraguan self-determination that it has so idealistically pursued. It should seek a diplomatic settlement with border inspections, neutral observers, and other devices that Nicaragua had been requesting for 7 years, a fact unmentioned, though the United States frankly will have to bear the major share of enforcement. The United States must be prepared to use force if it detects a violation while assisting the Central American democracies that are threatened by Nicaraguan subversion and aggression. Recall that these are the thoughts of a leading dove and that they seem unremarkable to liberal American opinion. Important facts about the political culture. These thoughts fall squarely within the conception of U.S. policy outlined by other Carter administration Latin American specialists. Robert Pastor as the dovish extreme of the political and ideologic spectrum, by now perhaps well beyond it. Defending U.S. policy over many years, Pastor writes that the United States did not want to control Nicaragua or other nations in the region, but it also did not want to allow developments to get out of control. It wanted Nicaraguans to act independently, except when doing so would affect U.S. interests adversely. In short, Nicaragua and other countries should be free to do what we want them to do and should choose their course independently, as long as their choice confirms to our interests. If they use the freedom we accord them unwisely, then naturally we are entitled to respond in self-defense. Note that these ideas are close counterpart to the domestic conception of democracy as a form of population control. The basic presuppositions of discourse include those that we just viewed. U.S. foreign policy is guided by a yearning for democracy and general benevolent intent. History and the secret planning record may tell a rather different story, but they're off the media agenda. It follows that the use of force can only be an exercise in self-defense, and that those who try to resist must be aggressors, even in their own lands. What is more, no country has the right of self-defense against terrorist U.S. attacks, and the United States has a natural right to impose its will by force if necessary and feasible. The doctrine need not be expressed apart from periodic odes to our awesome nobility of purpose. Rather, they are simply presupposed, setting the bounds of discourse, and among the properly educated, the bounds of thinkable thought. In the first chapter, I mentioned of the ways of approaching the study of the media and evaluating models of media performance. One appropriate method is to consider the spectrum of opinion allowed expression. According to the propaganda model, one would expect the spectrum to be bounded by the consensus of powerful elites while encouraging tactical debate within. Again, the model is well confirmed. Consider U.S. policy with regard to Nicaragua, a topic that has probably elicited more controversy and impassioned rhetoric than any other during the past several years. There is debate between the hawks and doves. The position of the hawks is expressed by a joint declaration of the State and Defense Departments on International Human Rights Day in December 1986. In the American continent, there is no regime more barbaric and bloody, no regime that violates human rights in a manner more constant and permanent than the Sandinista regime. Similar sentiments are voiced in the media and political system, and it follows that we should support the democratic resistance to communist terror. At the other extreme, the Dove generally agree that we should dismiss the World Court, the United Nations, and other hostile forms that pander to communists and pathologic third world anti-Americanism. They offer their support for the noble objective of the Reagan administration to somehow democratize Nicaragua, but they feel that the Contras are not the instrument that will achieve that objective. Representative Michael Barnes, one of the most outspoken critics of the Contra option, a leading Senate Dove, Alan Cranston, recognizes the Contra effort is woefully inadequate to achieve democracy in Nicaragua, so we should find other means to isolate the reprehensible government in Managua and leave it to fester in its own justice, while blocking Sandinista efforts to export violent revolution. Media doves observe that Mr. Reagan's policy of supporting the Contras is a clear failure, so we should acquiesce in some negotiated regional arrangement that would be enforced by Nicaragua's neighbors, as Tom Wicker states. Expressing the same thought, the editors of Washington Post see the Contras as an imperfect instrument, so we must find other means to fit Nicaragua back into a Central American mode and impose reasonable conduct by regional standard. We must also recognize that the Sandinistas are communists to the Cuban or Soviet school and a serious menace to civil peace and democracy in Nicaragua and the stability and security of the region. We must contain the Sandinistas' aggressive thrust and demand credible evidence of reduced Sandinista support for El Salvador's guerrillas. None of this is debatable. It is a given. It is true, the editors proclaim. It is therefore irrelevant, for example, that Reagan administration efforts to provide evidence for their charges of Nicaraguan support for El Salvador guerrillas was dismissed without the merit by the World Court, and in fact just barely merit derision. At the outer limits of his dissent, the Nation columnist Jefferson Morley wrote in the New York Times that we should recognize that Nicaragua may be beyond the reach of our good intentions. Other doves that feel that we should not too quickly reject the State Department argument that agricultural cooperatives are legitimate targets for counterattacks because in a Marxist society geared up for war, there are no clear lines separating officials, soldiers, and civilians. What is required is careful cost-benefit analysis, a determination of the amount of blood and misery that will be poured in, and the likelihood that democracy will emerge at the other end. New Republic editor Michael Kinsley. Neither Kinsley nor the State Department explain why similar arguments do not justify attacks by Abu Nidal on Israel kibbutzim, far better defended against an incomparably lesser threat. And it is naturally taken to be our right as rulers of the world to carry out the cost-benefit analysis and to pour in blood and misery if we determine that the likelihood of democracy is sufficiently high. Notice that for the dove, it is obvious without comment that there is no need to impose regional arrangements on our Salvadoran and Guatemalan friends who have slaughtered perhaps 150,000 people during this period, or our clients in Honduras who kill fewer outright but have left hundreds of thousands to starve to death while the country exports food for the profit of agribusiness. We need not isolate these admirable figures or leave them to fester in their own juices. Their countries already conform to the Central American mode of repression, exploitation, and rule by privileged elements that accede to demands of U.S. power democracy. So even hideous atrocities are of no account, and they merit aid and an enthusiastic backing, accompanied by occasional sighs of regret over the violent tendencies in these backward societies if the terror, torture, and mutilation that we organize and support become too visible to ignore or attack the wrong targets, Christian Democrat political figures, rather than union and peasant organizers, for example. By 1986, the Contra option was opposed by 80% of the leaders, polls reported. The propaganda model would therefore predict debate over Contra aid, but near unanimity in opposition to the Sandinistas. To test the hypothesis, consider the period of maximum intensity of the debate over Nicaraguan policy. The first 3 months of 1986, when attention was focused on the issue of Contra aid. During these months, the New York Times and the Washington Post ran no fewer than 85 opinion columns on the matter, including regular columnists. As expected, they were divided over Contras and Contra aid. But of the 85 columns, 85 were critical of the Sandinistas, the overwhelming majority harshly so. Thus, close to 100% conformity was achieved on the major issue. It is not that more sympathetic voices are lacking in the mainstream. There are many who would easily qualify for admission to the forum if they had the right things to say, including Latin American scholars whose opinion pieces are regularly rejected, or the charitable development agency Oxfam, with long experience in the region, which found Nicaragua's record to be exceptional among the 76 developing countries in which it works in the commitment of the political leadership to improving the condition of the people and encouraging their active participation in the development process. Or consider the founder of Costa Rican democracy, Jose Figueres, who just at that time described himself in an interview as pro-Sandinista and quite friendly toward the Sandinistas, though Costa Rica generally is not, because public opinion is heavily influenced by the Costa Rican oligarchy who owns the newspapers and the radio stations. He added that the 2-to-1 margin in favor of the Sandinistas in the 1984 election, which he had witnessed as an observer, certainly seemed to reflect what you find in the streets. Figueres condemned Washington's incredible policies of persecuting the Sandinistas and its efforts to undo Costa Rica's social institutions and to turn our whole economy over to the business people, to the local oligarchy, or to U.S. or European companies. Though, as a dedicated supporter of the United States, he founded these efforts, no doubt well intentioned. The United States is turning most Central Americans into mercenaries for its attack against Nicaragua, he continued. I've been familiar with Nicaragua all my life, and never before have I seen, as I do now, a Nicaraguan government that cares for its people. In another interview, he reiterated that for the first time, Nicaragua has a government that cares for its people. Commenting on a recent visit, he said that he found a surprising amount of support in the government for the government in this invaded country, adding that the United States should allow the Sandinistas to finish what they started in peace. They deserve it. Such comments lack the ideologic serviceability, as does Figueres' statement that he understands why La Prensa was closed, having censored the press himself when Costa Rica was under attack by Somoza. Hence, Central America's leading Democratic figure must be censored out of the media, though his name may still be invoked for this anti-Sandinista crusade. Thus, New York Times Central American correspondent James Lemoyne, in one of his anti-Sandinista diatribes, refers to Figueres as the man who is widely considered the father of Costa Rican democracy, but does not tell us, nor would he or his colleague ever tell us, what Figueres has to say about the Sandinistas. The front page of the New York Times presents a picture of Nicaragua as seen through the eyes of James Lemoyne as he passed through a brutal and repressive state under one-party rule with crowds of pot-bellied urchins in the street, state security agents ubiquitous, and the army else everywhere, growing support for the peasant army struggling against Sandinista oppression, and the population reduced to bitterness and apathy, though somehow resisting a foreign attack under which any other state in the region and most elsewhere would have quickly crumbled. They do not present the picture seen by Figueres or by CIA appointed press spokesman for the Contras, Edgar Chamorro, on a 3-week visit just before Lemoyne's. Speaking to dozens of people in the streets after Sandinista rally, Chamorro found them very aware, very politically educated, very committed. They thought for themselves. They were there because they wanted to be there. The days are gone when a dictator can get up and harangue people. What I have seen here is very, very positive. People are walking on their own 2 feet, regaining the dignity and nationalism they had lost under Somoza. The Contras are like the Gurkhas in India, with the colonial mentality of those fighting for the empire. He spoke on radio and television in Managua, saying whatever I thought, criticizing Marxism, Leninism. He saw very little militarization and a deep sense of equality, one of the accomplishments of the revolution. I didn't see people hungry. Most people looked very healthy, strong, alive. And he saw few beggars, unlike Honduras, or even in city streets in the U.S. The opposition are the old oligarchy reliant on the United States. The war has led to a sense of nationalism, patriotism on the part of youth who are drafted. The Sandinistas continue to be a people's party with commitments of goals that inspire so many people. They are Nicaraguan nationals, revolutionaries who want a more egalitarian model to improve the lives of the majority. The elections were good, the government is legitimate, and we should try and change from inside. After leaving the Contras, Chamorro adds elsewhere, he lost the easy media access of his Contra days. Readers of the New York Times do not receive a range of perceptions such as these, but only one, the one that accords with the needs of the state. A year after these visits, severe malnutrition began to appear in Managua and parts of the countryside as U.S. terrorists and economic warfare continued to take their bitter toll in a pathetically poor country, which for obvious historical and geopolitical reasons is utterly dependent on economic relations with the United States. George Shultz, Elliot Abrams, and their cohorts may not have overthrown the government, but they can take pride in having vanquished the propaganda of development, preventive medical care, and welfare that offered hope to the poor majority for the first time. Their achievements can be measured by the significant increase in dying infants, epidemics, and other normal features of the Central American mode, to which Nicaragua is to be restored by U.S. benevolence. The propaganda system may cover their tracks today, but history will render a different judgment. Returning to the 85 opinion columns in the Times and the Post, even more interesting than the uniform hostility to the Sandinistas was the choice of topics. There are two very striking differences between the Sandinistas and the U.S. favorites who adhere to regional standards. The first is that the Sandinistas, whatever their sins, had not conducted campaigns of mass slaughter, torture, mutilation, and general terror to traumatize the population. In the 85 columns, there is not a single phrase referring to this matter, an illustration of its importance in American political culture. The second major difference is that the Sandinistas diverted resources to the poor majority and attempted measure of meaningful social reform quite successfully. In fact, until U.S. economic and military warfare succeeded in reversing the unwelcome improvement in health and welfare standards, literacy, and development. These facts merit two passing phrases in 85 columns. One in a bitter condemnation of the generally appalling leadership in this repressive society. There is no word on the fact that, unlike U.S. clients, the Sandinistas had protected the poor from starvation, eliciting much scorn about their economic mismanagement, scorn that is withheld from Honduras, which permits peasants to starve en masse while exporting specialty crops and beef to the United States, and from U.S. policymakers who impose development policies on Central America that produce statistical growth, eliciting much self-congratulation and starvation about which we hear much less. There is no mention of Sandinistas' efforts to maintain a neutralist posture. For example, the trade figures at the time of the U.S. embargo that virtually wiped out private business and helped reduce the economy to bare survival. Nicaraguan trade with the Soviet bloc was then the same level as U.S. trade with these countries and well below that of Europe and most of the Third World. Such matters are unhelpful for acquired doctrine, thus better ignored. More generally, all of the 85 columns stay safely within the approval bounds. Even the contributors who elsewhere have taken an independent stance do not do so here. A reader brought the published study of the spectrum of expressible opinion to the attention of Times dove Tom Wicker, who devoted part of the column to denouncing it. He gave two reasons for dismissing the study. First, he saw no reason why I have to praise the Sandinistas, which is quite true and entirely irrelevant. As was clear and explicit, the individual contributions were not an issue, but rather the range of permitted views. The question is not whether Wicker should be granted the opportunity to express his opinion that a regional arrangement must be imposed on Nicaragua alone and enforced by U.S. terror states, but when in a free press, the spectrum of opinions should be bounded by this position as the extreme of permissible dissent from government policy. Wicker's second reason was that criticism by foot rule and calculator is often as simplistic as the reportage it purports to measure. Curious to learn whether Wicker had some methodologic or other critique to support this judgment, I wrote him a series of letters of inquiry eliciting no response, from which I can only conclude that his objections is to the very idea of conducting a rational inquiry into the functioning of the media. Note that his reaction and the general dismissal of the extensive documentation supporting the propaganda model is quite in accord with its predictions. Perhaps, nevertheless, the sample of the major journals at the peak period of debate is misleading. Let us turn then to another sample a year later. In the first 6 months of 1987, the same two journals ran 61 columns and editorials relevant to U.S. policy in Nicaragua. Of these, 13 favored diplomatic measures over Contra aid, saying nothing about the Sandinistas. Of the 48 that expressed an opinion, 46 were anti-Sandinista, again, most of them bitterly so. Of these, 18 were pro-Contra and 8 anti-Contra, primarily on the grounds that the Contras were inept and could not win, or that the U.S. goal of forcing the Sandinista revolution into the American democratic mold might not be worth the risk. John Oakes of the New York Times at the dissident extreme. Of the two columns that expressed some sympathy for the Sandinistas, one was the Nicaraguan ambassador Carlos Tunnerman, the other by Dr. Kevin Cahill, director of Tropical Disease Center of Lenox Hill Hospital in New York, the only non-Nicaraguan commentator who could draw upon personal experience in Nicaragua and elsewhere in the Third World. His was also the only column that took note of the successful Nicaraguan health and literacy measures in the struggle against oppression and corruption, waged under conditions of an extreme adversary, of extreme adversity imposed by U.S. terrorists and economic warfare. Calhill's one of the two contributions among 61 that mention the World Court decision and international law. Two others, one by Tunnerman, refer to them obliquely. These facts reflect the attitude toward the rule of law and the dominant intellectual culture. We read that the United States is working through the Contras to restore democracy to Nicaragua and break the Sandinistas, Cuban and Soviet ties, and that Washington's role is to help to contain the spread of Sandinista revolution beyond Nicaragua. The editors of the Washington Post, who suggest that the United States test the Latin American consensus, that there is a better chance of reining in the Sandinistas by political envelopment than by military assault. And we are treated to charges of genocide of the Mosquito Indians. William Buckley, who concedes that the Sandinistas have not yet reached the level of Pol Pot, but they are plainly heading that way. But apart from Cahill, we read not a word about the constructive policies that were successfully pursued and that in the real world elicited U.S. terror to rein in the Sandinistas, another inexpressible thought. Once again, not a single phrase refers to the fact that unlike U.S. clients in the fledgling democracies, the Sandinistas had not launched a campaign of terror and slaughter to traumatize their populations. Rather, as a huge mass of generally ignored documentation demonstrates, the task had been assigned to the U.S. proxy forces. The inconvenient fact is placed in proper perspective by former Times executive editor A.M. Rosenthal, who writes that James Lemoyne's carefully reported sensitive accounts in the Times of rebel troops inside Nicaragua indicate growing self-confidence and skill. The totalitarian Sandinistas are contrasted with the struggling democracies of Central America, the imperfect but working democracies of Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, which under communist guerrilla siege is an imperfect democracy, but democracy with an elicited government. Post-columnist Stephen Rosenfield, unlike Nicaragua, where there were no elections, no Washington has decreed. The assumptions revealed in these samples of expressible opinion are the very foundations of discourse beyond challenge. The effectiveness of the state doctrine that there were no elections in Nicaragua, in contrast to the U.S. terror states, provide useful lessons for future commissars. It confirms the judgment of Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information, the Creel Commission, that one of the best means of controlling news was flooding news channels with facts, or what amounted to official information, by dint of the endless repetition combined with media election coverage conforming to Washington dictates. The required doctrine has become established truth. Virtually no deviations are to be found. Even human rights groups have made a real effort to steer an even course to fall prey to these impressive achievements of state media propaganda. Thus, the deputy director of Human Rights Watch criticizes the Reaganites for inconsistency. They have been loath to speak out about abuses under elected governments. He mentions El Salvador and Guatemala, but they condemn human rights abuses by the hemisphere's left-wing regimes, Cuba and Nicaragua. On the one hand, we have elected governments of El Salvador and Nicaragua, quote-unquote elected, and on the other, Nicaragua, left-wing, and therefore lacking a quote-unquote elected government. At the outer reaches of the dissidents in the media, the liberal Boston Globe contrasts El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, quote, unstable democratic, with Cuba, Nicaragua, Guyana, and Suriname, quote-unquote socialist. The democratic governments, quote-unquote, have civilian presidents who were elected, though they are battling the army for political control. But in Nicaragua, we have only a socialist junta in power since 1979 revolution. No elections, no democracy, as in the U.S. clients. To escape the impact of well-functioning system of propaganda that bars dissent and unwanted fact while fostering lively debate within the permitted bounds is remarkably difficult. In recognition of the importance of preventing free flow of ideas, the U.S. government has long sought to impress upon its clients the need to monitor and control travel and published materials. Thus, President Kennedy met with several Central American presidents in San Jose, Costa Rica in March 1963, where the seven agreed to an April meeting in Somoza, Nicaragua, to develop and put into immediate effect common measures to restrict the movement of subversive nationals to and from Cuba and the flow of materials, propaganda, and funds from that country. In secret internal documents, the Kennedy liberals were concerned over the excessive liberalism of Latin American regimes, in particular the reluctance of governments to establish bilateral and multilateral arrangements for the control of travelers, such as exist and are extensively applied in the United States. For similar reasons, there is no concern here when the independent media are destroyed by violence and U.S. dependencies, or are securely in the hands of reliable right-wing elements, or when censorship is imposed by government terror, assassination, or imprisonment of journalists. At home, such measures are obviously inappropriate. More delicate ones are required, more sophisticated procedures of manufacture, of consent. The commitment to block the free flow of ideas reflects a deeper concern. For global planners, much of the third world has been assigned the role of service to the industrial capitalist centers. Its various regions must fulfill their functions as sources of raw materials and markets, and must be exploited for the reconstruction and development of Western capitalism, as secret documents frankly explain. It is, of course, understood that much policies leave the United States politically weak, though militarily strong, the constant lament of government specialists and other commentators, and a fact recognized by the victims as well in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. Although banning of improper thoughts, free travel, and subversive attitudes and subversive nationals can perhaps compensate in part for the political weakness of the United States and its clients, planners have clearly and explicitly recognized that the United States will ultimately have to rely on force, the local security forces if possible, to contain dissidents and popular movements. The basic commitments explain not only the regular reliance on military and state terrorism, but also the hostility to democracy in the sense of popular participation in public affairs that is such a striking feature of U.S. policy in the third world, sometimes becoming a real passion as under the Reagan administration. For the same reasons, the Kennedy administration shifted the mission of the Latin American military from hemispheric defense to internal security, and the United States lent support to the national security states that spread throughout the region in subsequent years. Latin American Lara Schultz observes that these new forms of military authoritarianism developed in response to increased popular participation and aimed to destroy a perceived threat to the existing structure of socioeconomic privilege by eliminating the political participation of the numerical majority, principally the working, or, to use a broader, more accurate term, popular classes. It is only when the threat of popular participation is overcome that democratic forms can be safely contemplated. The same considerations explain why it is necessary to block dangerous ideas and anti-US of subversion. Indeed, anything that might appeal to the popular classes who are to be excluded from the political system. This combination of political weakness and military strength underlies State Department concerns that the government of Guatemala in the early 1950s was too democratic, treating the Communist Party as an authentic domestic political party and not as part of the worldwide Soviet communist conspiracy. It also explains why, in the early post-war period, the United States undertook a worldwide campaign to undermine the anti-fascist resistance, suppressing unions and other popular organizations, and blocking democratic politics in Japan, Europe, and much of the third world until popular outcomes were assured, while its junior partner in global management established its harsh rule in its own narrower domains. One of the bases for maintaining stability in client states of the Latin American variety is a symbiotic relationship between domestic liberalism and political figures in the dependencies who provide a facade for military rule. The conditions of the relationship are that the Democrats in Central America pursue their task of preserving privilege and U.S. interests, while American liberals laud the encouraging growth of the tender plant of democracy, while providing the means for continuing terrorist assault against the population by the state security services and the death squads closely linked to them. Well, after the 1984 elections that established democracy in El Salvador, to the applause of the Free Press, the human rights organization Sirocco Jurisdiccio, operating under the protection of the Archdiocese of San Salvador, observed that the continuing terror is still conducted by the same members of the armed forces who enjoy official approval and are adequately trained to carry out these acts of collective suffering. Salvadoran society affected by terror and panic, a result of the persistent violation of basic human rights, shows the following traits: collective intimidation and generalized fear on the one hand, and on the other, internalized acceptance of the terror because of the daily and frequent use of violent means. In general, society accepts the frequent appearance of tortured bodies because basic rights, the right to life, has absolutely no overriding value for society. The last comment also applies to the supervisors of these operations, as underscored by George Solt in one of his Lamentations on Terrorism, a talk delivered just as the United States was carrying out the terror bombing of Libya. In El Salvador, he declared, the results are something all Americans can be proud of, at least all Americans who enjoy the sight of tortured bodies, starving children, terror and panic, and generalized fear. And James Lemoyne, in one of his carefully reported sensitive accounts, concludes that American support for elected governments in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras has been a relative success, no doubt true by some standards. The observations of Socorro Jurisdiccio on Salvadoran society and democracy was presented at the first international seminar on torture in Latin America, held at Buenos Aires in December 1985, a conference devoted to the repressive system that has as its disposal knowledge and a multinational technology of terror developed in specialized centers whose purpose is to perfect methods of exploitation, oppression, and dependence of individuals and entire peoples by the use of state terrorism inspired by the doctrine of national security. The doctrine can be traced to the historic decision of the Kennedy administration to shift the mission of the Latin American military to internal security, with consequences that are or should be well known. The conference passed without notice in the U.S. media. None of this falls within the canon of terrorism as conceived in the civilized world, or has the slightest bearing on the noble efforts of the United States to defend the imperfect but advancing democracies and to restore democracy to Nicaragua. Similarly, no celebration of the passionate U.S. commitment to human rights would be sullied by the mention of the striking correlation between the U.S. aid and torture worldwide, documented in several studies, particularly in Latin America, where the leading academic specialist on human rights in the region concludes that U.S. aid has tended to flow disproportionately to Latin American governments which torture their citizens to the hemisphere's relatively egregious violators of fundamental human rights. This was prior to the Reagan administration during Carter's years, with its dedicated commitment to terror and torture. In one of the commentaries during the period we have been reviewing, the Times editors declared that the Sandinistas have to understand that their neighbors in Washington rightly see a connection between internal and external behavior. It must be then that the behavior of their neighbors in Washington illustrates this deep commitment to human rights. These editors also asked whether the Reagan administration could bring itself to take the calculated risk of political settlement and tolerate a Marxist neighbor if it is boxed in by treaties and commitments to rudimentary human rights, commitments unnecessary for the fledgling democracies or their sponsor. They urged that the United States test the possibility of securing Sandinista agreement to keep Soviet and Cuban bases, advisors, and missiles out of Nicaragua and agree not to export revolution across Nicaragua's borders. The missiles and Soviet-Cuban bases are presumably added for dramatic effect, and Nicaragua's repeated offers to eliminate foreign advisors and installations are unmentioned and are regularly unreported, just as no notice is merited when Cuba's foreign minister in early 1988 reiterated his country's offer to withdraw its military advisors from Nicaragua once the U.S.-backed Contra campaign against the Sandinista government ends. The perceived problem throughout has been to find some way to rein in the Sandinistas and contain their aggressive thrust. Washington Post reported to compel Nicaragua to rein in its revolutionary army, as Democratic Senator Terry Sanford demands, an army that is illegitimately rampaging in Nicaragua when it seeks to defend the country from U.S. attack. That Nicaragua might face some security problem remains beyond imagining. Apart from regular unsupported allegations of Sandinista aid to the Salvadoran guerrillas, to which I return, the proclaimed basis for these fears concerning the Sandinistas' threat to the hemisphere is another coup of the State Department's Operation Truth, based upon a speech by Commandant Thomas Bourget. In it, he expressed his hopes that Nicaragua would be an example that others would follow, explaining that Nicaragua cannot export our revolution, but can only export our example, while the people themselves of these countries must make the revolutions. In this sense, he said, the Nicaraguan revolution transcends national boundaries. In a conscious and purposeful fraud, the State Department's psychological operations converted these words into the threat of military conquest in pursuit of a quote unquote revolution without borders. The phrase was used as the title of the pathetic September 1985 State Department white paper on alleged Nicaraguan subversion, and repeatedly since, sometimes accompanied by the claim that this is a Sandinista Mein Kampf, as George Shultz warned Congress. The same fabrication served as the climax for Reagan's successful effort to obtain $100 million from Congress for the proxy army, just as the World Court called upon the United States to terminate its aggression, and it remains a media staple in news columns and commentary, as I have reviewed elsewhere. The hoax was exposed at once by the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, and even received marginal notice in a review of State Department public diplomacy in the Washington Post. But none of this deterred media agritrop in service of the worthy project to demonstrate the Sandinista government and to turn it into a real enemy and threat in the minds of the American people. As the Reagan administration official phrased the goal, nor are these exercises of perception management deterred by the evident absurdity of the idea that Nicaragua could pose a threat of aggression while the U.S. stands by in helpless impotence. Again, a most impressive demonstration of what can be achieved by a mobilized independent press. There was, to be sure, a basis for the perception that Nicaragua posed a threat. The real fear was that Borges' hopes might be realized. As Oxfam observed, Nicaragua posed the threat of a good example. Like Arevalo and Arbenz in Guatemala, Allende in Chile, and many others, Nicaragua was perceived as a rotten apple that might infect the barrel, a virus that might infect others, a cancer that might spread, in the terminology constantly used by planners when they contemplate the dread prospect of independent development geared to domestic needs. The real fear was expressed by Secretary of State Shultz in March 1986 when he warned that if the Sandinistas succeed in consolidating their power, then all the countries in Latin America who all face serious internal economic problems will see radical forces emboldened to exploit these problems. It is therefore necessary to destroy the virus and inoculate the surrounding regions by terror, the persistent feature of terrorist U.S. foreign policy, based on the same concerns that animated Metternich and the Tsar with regard to the threat of civilized order posed by American democracy. But these truths lie too far beyond the bounds of what can be expressed or imagined. Returning to the range of expressible opinion, the second sample of opinion columns, like the first, confirms to the expectation of the propaganda model, as do others. News reporting satisfies the same conditions, as has been documented in many investigations, ensuring that the public opinion will not stray from proper bounds, at least among those segments of the population that count. So that's the chapter, the bounds of the expressible. We were going to just review real quick the ideas here. Basically we can see, we spoke of, basically it's a system of authoritarian kind of, a fascist system of thought control. It's a fascist system of, thought control. Democracy is not present in American, press, in American government, communications. There is no democracy. It is a capitalist elite. It is a capitalist body, that runs the government. And, all of it is capitalism. All of it run around it is capitalism. The military, the economy, their money, all of the things, the social progress of people, it's all in the capitalist elite's hands. So hence, anyone who in the third world is seeking to, medicalize, make medical medicine a social progress, get a centralized healthcare system, becomes a rotten apple, like the threat of a good example, like Nicaragua is, highly featured in this article as, with respect to the threat of a good example. The rot will spread. First, Nicaragua gets this socialist fever, and then it goes to El Salvador, Honduras, and then, Guatemala. So this is the key. This is the racist this is the racist American government. It's a terrorist government. He says very clearly that America is a terrorist state. It's, written in multiple places in the chapter. America is a terrorist nation. And the Congress, all of these senators he talked about, these are all Democratic senators who, Democratic Senator Terry Sanford, multiple Democratic senators were referred to. The U.S. Congress is a group of white terrorists. That's basically what it is. That is what is in this discussion, and that is what we read from it in our discussion. Official enemies have the right to self-defense. If Nicaragua attacks Contra forces, basically assistance, the Byrd Amendment on assistance, where the Nicaraguan resistance passed in August 1988 with the effusive support of leading senatorial doves. Again, Congress permitted military aid to the proxy forces within Nicaragua upon Sandinista initiation of an unprovoked military attack and any other hostile action directed against the forces of the Nicaraguan resistance or the Contras, or a continued unacceptable level of military assistance by the Soviet bloc countries, including Cuba, all other sources having been barred, and U.S. authorities being accorded the right to determine what is quote-unquote acceptable. The media had taken for granted throughout that it would be outrageous, another display of communist intransigence, if the army of Nicaragua were to attack terrorist forces within their own country. Months earlier, the press had reported a letter by House Democrats to President Ortega expressing their grave concern over the possibility of a military offensive against the Contras, which would lead to a consideration of a renewal of military aid to the resistance forces. The prohibition against self-defense remained in force after the U.S. clients has undermined negotiations with last-minute demands contrived to this end, to which we return. So you can see, they have a terrorist group that's attacking the Nicaraguan government, and the goal is to overthrow the government. So if you self-defend, the terrorist U.S. Congress, the white terrorists of the American Congress and the American terrorist government is saying that if you attack the Contras, that, we have the right to supply more and we have the right to attack you. As you can see, this is all a deceptive group of frauds. This is a group of colonial frauds, racist frauds of the U.S. government and their press. Their press, went along with their congressional leaders to, make the Sandinistas out to be a brutal dictatorship, a brutal communist group, just like the Cambodians, the Laotians, and the Vietnamese in Indochina, just like all of the different democratic countries that have, basically communist nations that have freed themselves from, tyranny, like even China. All of these countries to the U.S. is, it's, basically you're communist, you're susceptible to attack. We don't trust you. We don't agree with you. We'll murder you. That's the U.S. government's, actions. So let's continue. So we said capitalist elite propaganda, deception and thought control. All of it is here. It's an excellent chapter. Please read the book. Please read the book and listen to the video. I think it's excellent to understand all of the things that the U.S. government does to, show that it is really not interested in helping people. It is interested in only the threat of the good example, only the enslavement and racist subjugation of third world peoples, only colonialism with their friends in Europe, only colonialism and racist subjugation and, extermination, mass murder, extermination by the U.S. government, terrorist state. Adjuncts of government. It is very interesting. Senator William Fulbright observed in Senate hearings on Government and the Media in 1966, that so many of our prominent newspapers have become almost agents or adjuncts of the government that they do not contest or even raise questions about government policy. These remarks are not precisely accurate. The media do contest and raise questions about government policy, but they do so almost exclusively within the framework determined by the essentially shared interests of state corporate power. Divisions among elites are reflected in media debate, but departure from their narrow consensus is rare. It is true that the incumbent state managers commonly set the media agenda, but if the policy fails or is perceived to be harmful to powerful interests, then the media will often contest government policy and urge different means to achieve goals that remain beyond challenge or quite often even awareness. To illustrate, I have reviewed a few samples of the media's contribution to the government project of demonizing the Sandinistas while praising the violent terrorist states backed or directly installed by the United States in the region. With all the skepticism I have personally developed through studying media performance over many years, I had not expected that they would rise to this challenge. When writing in 1985 about the Reaganite disinformation programs concerning Central America, I did not compare Nicaragua to El Salvador and Guatemala to demonstrate the hypocrisy of the charges, where they were not outright lies. There seemed an insult to the reader's intelligence. Instead, I compared the allegations concerning Nicaragua with the behavior of the model democracy of Israel during the same period and that of the United States itself in wartime conditions, showing that the Sandinistas' record was respectable by these, admittedly not very impressive standards. But my assessment of the media was naive. Within a year, they had succeeded in portraying the murderous U.S. clients as progressive, if flawed democracies, while the Sandinistas, guilty of no crime that even begins to approach those of Washington's favorites, had become the very embodiment of evil. The review in the last chapter of two periods of intense debate over U.S. policy towards Nicaragua kept to the spectrum of expressible opinion. News reporting confirms to the same implicit premises. The dichotomous treatment of the elections in El Salvador and Nicaragua provides one example studied in detail elsewhere. The period reviews in the last chapter provide another. Political scientist Jack Spence studied 181 New York Times articles on Nicaragua during the first 6 months of 1986. The conclusions are similar to those drawn from editorial and opinion columns. Spence observed that Central America was virtually ignored until U.S. control faced a challenge in 1978. From 1969 through 1977, the TV networks devoted a total of 1 hour to Nicaragua, all on the 1972 earthquake. They ignored the 1972 election in El Salvador, when the apparent victory of the Duarte Ungo reformist ticket was overturned by blatant fraud and intervention by the U.S. clients in Nicaragua and Guatemala, guaranteeing the military rule that continue until the present. There being no challenge to U.S. domination, the problem of establishing democracy did not arise, just as it did not arise in 1984 in Panama, when the notorious drug dealer General Noriega, then still a U.S. favorite, ran a fraudulent election legitimized by the attendance of George Shultz at the inauguration, where he praised the vote as a triumph for democracy, taunting Nicaragua to do the same after having been briefed by the CIA and the U.S. ambassador that Noriega had stolen upwards of 50,000 ballots in order to ensure the election of his candidates. Throughout the 1970s, the media ignored the growing crisis of access to land in Central America that lies at the roots of the current turmoil. In the first 6 months of 1986, Spence observed the crucial issue of access to land and land ownership patterns in Nicaragua received one sentence in the 181 articles, and agrarian policy was also virtually ignored in coverage of El Salvador, except for occasional mention of El Salvador's progressive reforms without serious analysis. And similarly, Nicaraguan issues such as the effects of the war on Nicaragua, Sandinista programs, popularity and support were not part of the news agenda. Most of the stories emanated from Washington and presented Reagan administration doctrine without challenge or analysis. including the laments about freedom fighters forced to fight with only boots and bandages against advanced Soviet armaments and Cuban-piloted helicopters. Brutal repression in this cancer right here on our landmass, as George Shultz stated. Guns to Colombian terrorists and subversion from Chile to Guatemala. Cuban troops swarming the streets of Managua by the scores in this terrorism sanctuary, 2 days' drive from Texas, a second Libya, and so on throughout the familiar litany. In its news column, Spence observes, the Times tacitly accepts the Reaganite views, seeking out no others, thus contributing to a drastic narrowing for public debate. Regarding the charges leveled against the Sandinistas, almost no contrary view could be found in the Times, and supporting evidence was never present. 4 times the Nicaraguan embassy was given a buried line or two, and in a few stories the reporter added a background balance line. It was as if the Times had a software program that at rare and odd intervals automatically kicked in a boilerplate balancing graph beyond the story's halfway point. Critics of Reaganite tactics were cited, but virtually nothing beyond these limits. As well known, the choice of sources can shield extreme bias behind a facade of objectivity. A study organized by media specialist Lance Bennett of the University of Washington investigated the distribution of attributed news sources for the month of September 1985 in the New York Times and the Seattle Press. In Times coverage of El Salvador, over 80% of the sources were supportive of the government of El Salvador. 10% were drawn from the opposition. In Times coverage of Nicaragua, this pattern was reversed. More than 2/3 of sources selected were hostile to the government of Nicaragua. Under 20% were from the government. The local media were similar. In fact, despite the apparent difference, the two patterns reflect the same criteria of source selection. In both cases, primary sources were the U.S. government and its allies and clients, the government of El Salvador, the Nicaraguan political opposition, and the Contras. The study observed that in both countries, the vast majority of Central Americans, the ordinary peasants, urban dwellers, workers, and merchants, are virtually mute in U.S. news coverage of their lives. They account for 9% of attributed news sources, of which 1/3 are U.S. individuals. The study suggests that the reasons for these discrepancies may lie in the tendency to rely on an easily available official sources and other such institutional factors. That is plausible, but one should not be misled. Opposition sources are, of course, easy to find in Nicaragua, where they operate freely and openly despite government harassment, while in El Salvador and Guatemala, most were murdered by the U.S.-backed security forces or fled. A non-trivial distinction that the media managed to suppress, indeed to reverse. In coverage of Afghanistan, the Kremlin is a more easily available source than guerrillas in the hills, but coverage is radically biased in the other direction, as it should be. Similarly, great efforts have been made to report the war in Nicaragua from the point of view of the Contras. Reporting from the point of view of the Salvadoran or Guatemalan guerrillas or the Viet Cong has been next to non-existent, and important sources that exist are often simply supposed. The same is true of the publication of refugee studies, which typically reflects political priorities, not ease of access. The instrumental factors are doubtless real, but throughout there are conscious choices that flow from doctrinal needs. Spence found the same tendencies in his study of news reporting on Nicaragua in early 1986. Top priority was given to the U.S. government. Ranking second was the U.S. proxy forces. The Contras received 727 column inches as compared to 417 for the Nicaraguan government, a discrepancy that was increased by 109 inches devoted to the U.S.-backed internal opposition in Nicaragua, overwhelming those who had refused to participate in the 1984 elections as the U.S. government had demanded. There were extensive reports of the concerns of the Businessmen's Association, COSEP, harassment of the U.S.-funded journal La Prensa, one of those owners whose owners was issuing thinly veiled calls for Contra aid in Washington at the time, and other abuses. Coverage of the U.S. clients was largely favorable. Only one of 33 stories on the Contras focused on human rights abuses, and there were few other references to atrocities that were by then reaching a remarkable scale. Like the State Department and Congress, the media preferred what human rights investigators describe as intentional ignorance. Turning to El Salvador, we find that the pattern is sharply reversed. Here, the guerrillas were castigated as Marxist terrorists, and the official line, as laid forth in the New York Times editorial, was that things were improving under the democratic government of the Honorable Mr. Duarte, the honest, reform-minded Christian Democrat who was desperately trying to lead his people to a better life while beset by implacable extremes. Though he may have been less than rigorous in bringing death squad operatives to judicial control. In translation, he has done nothing to curb the security forces he praises for their valiant service alongside the people against subversion, while concluding quietly that the masses were with the guerrillas when he assumed that the role of front man for the war against the population. News reporting was similar in style. Duarte was portrayed in the major media as a victim, not as a willing agent whose role was to ensure adequate congressional funding for the state terrorists whom he protected. Analyzing over 800 articles in the major dailies from March 1984 through October 1985, journalist Mark Cooper found a consistent pattern of suppressing massive atrocities and singing the praise of administration policy. There were hundreds of column inches lauding Duarte's promises to end the rampant state terror conducted under his aegis, but virtually nothing on his actual record of apologetics for state terror and service to it, and not a single article analyzing the nature of Duarte's alliance with the military establishment, the effective rulers. In the editorials reviewed over 6.5 years, the Times never mentioned such matters as the assassination of Archbishop Romero or the aid by the security forces on the legal aid office of the bishopric to destroy evidence implicating them in the assassination, the destruction and closure of the university by the army, with many killed, the physical destruction of the independent media, and the murder and expulsion of their editors and publishers, or the Salvadoran state of siege from March 1980 when Duarte joined the junta under which the atrocities were conducted, with his backing and constant apologetics. In contrast, when Nicaragua declared a state of siege on October 15, 1985, the Times bitterly condemned this demonstration of Nicaragua's lack of respect for democracy and human rights, dismissing with contempt President Ortega's claim that the crackdown is the fault of the brutal aggression by North America and its internal allies. The renewal of El Salvador's far more draconian state of siege 2 days later received no mention. The events ignored in the editorials were also largely suppressed or falsified in the news columns. There was no hint or concern in the editorials, and little, if any, reporting about the fact that since 1981, the Salvadoran press has either supported the government or criticized it from a right-wing perspective, avoiding stories critical of government forces from a human rights standpoint, as observed in an America's Watch review of freedom of the press. The political opposition had been murdered by Duarte's security forces or had fled the country, so there was no need to report or comment on their problems. Similarly, no second thoughts were aroused by the fact that one of the leading murderers was selected to be Duarte's Minister of Defense, having completed his service as director of the National Guard. Earlier, he had coolly explained that the armed forces are prepared to kill 200 to 300,000 if that's what it takes to stop a communist takeover. And he had acted accordingly as the Guard under his command administered his pedagogy of terror. When he was named defense minister, this mass murder and torture was described by the New York Times as a quote unquote soft-spoken, amiable man who has a reputation as an excellent administrator, conceding that the Guard under his command had been responsible for horrible atrocities, including the rape and murder of 4 American church women and the assassination of 2 U.S. labor advisors. The Time adds that, quote, in his defense, others contend that under his command, the National Guard's reputation has improved to the point where it is no longer considered the most abusive of Salvador's 3 security forces, an impressive achievement, doubtless. With regard to Nicaragua, in contrast, the typical pattern was for the state propaganda services to concoct some charge that the media would then prominently and uncritically relay. Occasionally, when the charges were recognized to be too outlandish, a mild disclaimer might appear on the inside pages. Often the charges persisted even when they were acknowledged to be groundless or even sheer fabrication, a pattern that has been well documented in the case of other official enemies. To fully appreciate the dichotomous treatment, we must bear in mind what had been happening in Nicaragua and El Salvador during these years, the facts that I presume are familiar and so will not review here. The disgrace of the free press could hardly be more dramatic. It is worth stressing that far more is at issue here than dereliction of duty, incompetence, or service to power. The protection afforded by state terrorists in the fledgling democracies provides a veil behind which they can pursue their atrocities with crucial U.S. support, while the indignant focus on far lesser abuses in Nicaragua has facilitated the Reagan programs of terror and economic warfare that reverse social and economic progress in Nicaragua and reverse the social and reduce the economy to ruins, permitting regular media gloating away over Sandinista incompetence and malevolence. The media were willing accomplices in an extraordinary outburst of violence and repression by the United States of America. The point is more general. The U.S. government has been able to provide crucial support for mass slaughter by its Indonesian client in Timor with the help of other Western powers because the media simply refused to investigate the facts or report what they knew. The same was true of the destruction of the peasant societies of northern Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam, among many other cases. To mention only one current example, Israel has been emboldened to conduct its pogroms in the occupied territories by the same indulgence, knowing that all would be explained away as regrettable exceptions by its U.S. apologists, the editorial staff of the New York Times, the U.S. labor bureaucracy, or Elie Wiesel, the noted apostle of the obligation of silence in the face of atrocities by the state one loves, among many others. To raise the level of public understanding of Central American affairs during the critical early 1986 period, the Times devoted the cover story in the Sunday magazine to an analysis by James Lemoyne of the deeper issues behind the rise of the guerrilla network. Lemoyne observes that virtually every study of the region has concluded that the revolutions of Central America primarily have been caused by decades of poverty, bloody repression, and frustrated efforts at bringing about political reform. Furthermore, every serious study has concluded that the United States bears a certain responsibility for these conditions, hence for the rise of the guerrilla network, but no hint of that will be discovered in Lemoyne's discussion. He considers the role of Cuba, the Soviet Union, North Korea, the PLO, Vietnam, and so on. But one participant in the drama is missing, except for a statement that in El Salvador, the United States bolstered the Salvadoran army, insisted on elections, and called for some reforms. Also missing is the fact that the army we bolstered conducted a program of slaughter and torture to destroy the people's organizations fighting to defend their most fundamental human rights. To borrow the words of Archbishop Romero shortly before his assassination, as he vainly pleaded with President Carter not to bolster these forces, which know only how to repress the people and defend interests of the Salvadoran oligarchy. This combination of convenient historical ignorance and praise for the benevolent of our intentions is typical of media and other commentary. To cite only one more example, in an earlier Time magazine cover story, Tad Soap discussed the radical winds of the Caribbean, noting that the roots of the Caribbean problems are not entirely Cuban. The Soviet offensive is also to blame, with the consequences of colonial greed and mismanagement by European powers. The United States is blamed only for indifference, quote unquote, to the brewing problems. Few seem willing to comprehend the observation by former Costa Rican President Daniel Oduber that the thugs who threaten the lives of Central Americans and their families are not Leninist commissars, but the armed sergeants trained in the United States. Spence observes that the obviously relevant pending World Court decision was not mentioned in the 17 news stories that preceded the World Court decision itself on June 27, 1986. In this decision, the court condemned the United States for its support for the Contras and illegal economic warfare and ordered it desist from its violations of international law and valid treaties and to pay reparations. The decision was reported but dismissed as a minor annoyance. Its contents were suppressed or falsified. The World Court, not the United States, was portrayed as a criminal, and the rule of law was held inapplicable to the racist, terrorist United States government. In its editorial response on July 1st, the Times dismissed the court as a hostile forum. The editors have voiced no criticism when this same hostile forum ruled in favor of the United States in the matter of the Iran hostage crisis. They stated that even the majority of the court acknowledged that prior attacks against El Salvador from Nicaragua made collective defense a possible justification for America's retaliation. The editors assumed without comment that the United States was retaliating against Nicaraguan aggression and failed to mention that the court had explicitly rejected the claim of collective self-defense as a justification, even if the United States could establish the charges against Nicaragua that the court rejected as groundless. After examining the evidence in official U.S. government documents, the court also noted, rather sardonically, that El Salvador has not even charged armed attack against until August 1984, 4 months after Nicaragua had brought the claim to the court. In a July 17 op-ed, Thomas Frank of New York University Law School, a noted advocate of world order, argued that the United States should dismiss the World Court ruling because America, acting alone or with its allies, still needs the freedom to protect freedom, as in Nicaragua, for example. The U.S. government and the media are surpassed by none in their appeals to the August rule of law and the call for diplomacy rather than violence when the dereliction of official enemies are at issue. Hence, the events of summer 1986 called for some careful perception management until June. Nicaragua's failure to accept the Contadora Treaty draft was a major story. In May, the New York Times published a lengthy report by Stephen Kinzer, headline "Nicaragua Balks at the Latin Peace Accord," criticizing Ortega for his unwillingness to sign the agreement without some commitment from the United States. Nicaragua appears to be the only Central American nation reluctant to sign the draft agreement. Kinzer wrote, a few weeks later, Contadora was off the agenda. In mid to June, of the U.S. client states rejected the treaty draft under U.S. pressure. The fact was excluded from the national press, though reported abroad. Nicaragua declared its readiness to sign the treaty on June 21st. The Washington Post ignored the unwelcome fact, but it received oblique mention in two tiny items in the New York Times under the headings "Nicaragua makes offer to limit some weapons" and "U.S. condemns offer by Nicaragua on treaty," focusing on the Reagan administration rejection of the move as propagandists. Both items appeared in the Around the World roundup of the marginal news. For adjuncts of the government, news value is determined by utility for ideologic warfare. A few days after Nicaragua's acceptance of the treaty draft, blocked by the United States and its clients, the World Court condemned the United States for its unlawful use of force and called for the termination of U.S. aid to the Contras. Congress reported by voting $100 million of military aid to implement the unlawful use of force, while governing officials commented happily, "This is for real. This is a real war." Still pursuing the peace means that all states are obliged to follow under international and U.S. law. Nicaragua brought the matter to the UN Security Council, where the United States vetoed a resolution 11-1, 3 abstentions, calling on all states to observe international law. Nicaragua then turned to the General Assembly, which passed a resolution 94-3, calling for compliance with the World Court ruling. 2 client states, Israel and El Salvador, joined the United States in opposition. The Security Council vote merited a brief note in the newspaper of record, but the General Assembly endorsement passed unmentioned. The Times UN correspondent reported a story that day on overly high UN salaries. At the same session, Nicaragua called upon the UN to send an independent fact-finding mission to the border after conflict there. The proposal was rejected by Honduras with U.S. backing and was unreported. The general fate of Nicaraguan efforts to secure international monitoring of the borders which would, of course, curb the Sandinista aggression that so terrifies U.S. leaders and ideologic managers. A year later, on November 12, 1987, the General Assembly called for full and immediate compliance with the World Court decision. This time, only Israel joined the United States in opposing adherence to international law, another blow to the Central American Accords, which had been signed in August, much to the discomfiture of Washington. The vote was not reported by the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the three networks. Subsequent World Court proceedings on the matter of reparations to Nicaragua for U.S. crimes have also rarely reached the threshold. Thus, in August 1988 World Court announcement that the United States had failed to meet the court's deadline on determining war reparations passed virtually without notice. Not all UN resolutions are ignored. The day before the unreported 1987 General Assembly resolution, again calling on the United States to comply with international law, the Times ran a substantial story headline: UN urges Soviet to pull forces from Afghanistan, supporting that the General Assembly voted overwhelming today for the immediate withdrawal from Soviet forces from Afghanistan, brushing aside Moscow's first concept attempt to deflect such criticism from the United Nations in this annual resolution. A Times review of the General Assembly session of on December 26th, headline: General Assembly delivers setback to U.S. and Soviet. Subheaded: Washington losses on budget, Moscow on Afghanistan and Cambodia issues. The report mentioned nothing about the 94-2 vote on the World Court decision, in which the majority included U.S. allies, Australia, Canada, Iceland, and the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, and Spain, as well as major Latin American countries: Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela, along with Sweden, Finland, and others. The reaction of the U.S. government and the media to world opinion is expressed through international institutions deserves closer attention. The same UN session provides a number of interesting examples. While all eyes focused on the Washington summit, the INF Treaty, and Reagan achievements as a peacemaker, the UN voted on a series of disarmament resolutions. The General Assembly voted 154-1 with no abstentions, opposing the buildup of weapons in outer space, a resolution clearly aimed at Reagan's strategic defense initiative. It voted 135-1 against developing weapons of mass destruction. In both cases, the United States was alone in opposition. The United States was joined by France in opposing the opposition in the resolution, passed 143-2, calling for a comprehensive test ban treaty. Another vote calling for a halt to all nuclear test explosions, passed by a vote of 137-3, with the United States joined by France and Britain in opposition. A week later, the New York Times Magazine published a review of Star Wars program by its correspondent William Broad, observing that since the dawn of the space age, many people have felt that the man's final frontier, the edge of the universe, should be preserved, used exclusively for peaceful purposes, and raising the question of whether space should be armed. But the expression of opinion on the matter by the World Court community merited no comment. All of these votes were unreported and unmentioned in the review of setbacks of the U.S. and Soviet at the United Nations. Other New York Times reports on the same UN session provide further insight into the style of coverage of world opinion. 2 days after the overwhelming UN votes in favor of unreported disarmament resolutions that the United States opposed virtually alone, a Times story reported a vote on a resolution that reaffirms the United Nations' previous strong condemnation of international terrorism in all its forms, calls on all countries to cooperate in eradicating terrorism, and invites the Secretary General to seek the views of member states on terrorism and on the ways and means of combating it. The resolution passed 128-1, Israel alone in opposition, with the United States abstaining and other 128 members present voting in favor. The headline reads: Syria isolated, UN drops terrorism plan. 5 days later, the General Assembly passed a resolution condemning terrorism, and by whomever committed. The vote was 153-2, with Israel and the United States opposed and Honduras alone abstaining. In particular, all NATO countries voted for it. The vote was unreported and unmentioned in the December 26th review of the session. The U.S.-Israeli objection was presumably based on the statement that nothing in the resolution would prejudice the plights of people, particularly those under colonial or racist regimes, or under foreign occupation or other forms of domination, to struggle for self-determination, freedom, and independence, and to seek and receive support for that aid. Medial refusal to report the isolation of the United States and Israel on these matters is of no small importance, as was illustrated a year later when the Palestine National Council met in Algiers in November 1988 and passed an important political resolution centered on the declaration of a Palestinian independence issued on November 15th. The resolution opened by stating, "This session of the PNC was crowned by the declaration of a Palestinian state on our Palestinian territory. This, however, was not to the taste of U.S. policymakers, so that the matter quickly moved to the margins of media discussions." The PNC resolution went on to suggest modalities for implementing the political settlement that would include an independent national state for the Palestinians and arrangements for security and peace for all the states of the region. Here we enter into the areas that the U.S. government is willing to consider, so these issues quickly became the focus of media attention. The PNC resolution called for an international conference on the basis of United Nations Security Council resolutions 242 and 338 and the assurance of legitimate national rights of the Palestinian people, and first and foremost, their right to self-determination. In its statement, the PNC again declares its rejection of terror in all its forms, including state terror, and renews its commitment to the United Nations resolutions that affirm the rights of people to resist foreign occupation, colonialism, and racist discrimination, and their right to struggle for their independence. The latter phrases reiterate the content and wording of the unreported General Assembly resolution on terrorism. The rejection and denunciation of terrorism was nothing new. Thus, the PLO journal Shun Fidastania, May to June 1986, Philistinia, May to June 1986, presents the text of PLO proposal, which calls for an international conference, including the Israeli government, and aimed at reaching a peaceful settlement of the Palestinian peoples on the basis of the pertinent United Nations resolutions, including Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. The text continues, the PLO declares its rejection and denunciation of terrorism, which had been assured in the Cairo Declaration of November 1985. So we're going to stop there. We did about 43 pages, similar to yesterday, 2 hours and 5 minutes. Just some quick comments. So you can see the U.S. supported murderous regimes, terrorist regimes in El Salvador. The U.S. media followed right along the lead of U.S. government propaganda, lies, fabrication, falsifications, omissions, just a state deception, a deception. The Western governments, the racist colonial Western governments of the British and French, helped the U.S. in this, discussion regarding test ban treaty. They didn't want a treaty calling for, nuclear, test ban. They were, opposed to that resolution because they wanted more nuclear weapons. It's a mafia group. It's a nuclear mafia state of, Western gangsters. And they, use their nuclear weapons at any notice to, point the finger and say, you push yourself, you push, you show too much ego to us and we nuke you. That is the Western government's racist, colonialist, gangsters. They're, coalition of gangster mafia group and, in colonialism. We talked a lot about the El Salvadoran murders and the El Salvadoran regime, the U.S. media falling, promoting the, Duarte regime, the mass murder and torture. The New York Times said, you should, be more, understanding of the guy. Right? I mean, basically, when he was named defense minister, this mass murder and torture was described by the New York Times as a soft-spoken, amiable man who has a reputation as an excellent administrator. Okay, basically, the Times adds that in his defense, others contend that under his command, the National Guard's reputation has improved to the point where it is no longer considered the most abusive of Salvador's three security forces, an impressive achievement, doubtless. Obviously, this is a killer. This is a mass murder, torture. He has a pedagogy of terror in El Salvador, and this mass murder is being given praise by the New York Times. And the Nicaragua, it's the opposite. The Sandinistas are, bloody murderers. It's a communist tyranny. The standard stuff, the U.S. government, deceptive fraud media, a racist group of, a racist group of colonial gangsters. It's a colonial group of white thugs of the U.S. government. That's, pretty much what it is. The white thugs of the U.S. government, the mass murderers and butchers, the American terrorist government, basically does all of these things and then uses its media to hide and deceive everyone, making it seem that the Sandinistas, the world court, are the criminals. We say the world court are the criminals, and, they should be banished to, nothingness. They are, not given legal, process in the United States. Who is the American government to dismiss the world court? They are white thugs. They are mafia. It's a mafia group of thugs, and that is what we know. So excellent book, Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Societies, Noam Chomsky. We're going to finish with a few closing comments here, and then, we'll be done. Sorry, it took 2 hours and 8 minutes, but it should be done in 2. Please download the PDF of the Google Book Drive link at the description section. We discussed 2 chapters yesterday of Chomsky's book, Democracy in the Media and Containing Democracy. Dr. Chomsky describes the U.S. media as a fascist, authoritarian media similar to Nazi Germany and Hitler's media, as well as Stalin's media. There is no room for free speech or open discussion. It is simply an elite white capitalist American or Western European who decides the direction of the country, both domestically and militarily. Of course, it is fascist and highly racist, and this is proven by the thought control that the media displays in its propaganda machinations that it makes with respect to international conflict, especially. In Chapter 1, we discussed the U.S. government's suppression of the media through delusions that the media is anti-government and anti-American when they discuss any matter with respect to America that provides critical scholarly analysis. The racist American government promotes ideas of American innocence and American liberation of third world peoples when there is the message of American guilt and shame for criminal terrorist acts and enslavement pursuits by the third world peoples. We also discussed in Chapter 2 an example of the U.S. government depiction of American innocence in El Salvador. Napoleon Gonzalez, operator of the only independent press in El Salvador that was not government, pleaded with the United States and New York not to destroy his paper that he had worked hard in and was needing to discuss American atrocities in El Salvador. The U.S. machine gunned his office and murdered him. Bombs were planted in his newspaper outlet, and his press was destroyed, and he was hunted down by the U.S. government terrorist whites of Washington and murdered with machine gun fire. When asked what happened, then the U.S. denied responsibility since they will never pay reparations for murder by the American terrorist government. We also discussed in Chapter 2, Containing the Enemy, about Agent Orange. The U.S. government committed war crime against the Indo-Chinese people through Agent Orange, a toxic defoliant that was used generously against the third world peoples of Indochina. The racist white American murderous butchers created medical malformations, including deformed babies, thousands of cancers, fetal retardation, and tried to create a group of retards in Indochina using chemical warfare. As we know, they're a terrorist international group of gangsters, and racist third world murder is their specialty. It is necessary to explore these 2 new chapters, which we did, Bounds of the Expressible and Adjuncts of Government, in understanding the danger of the American totalitarian and fascist media. Please join me tomorrow for another, to finish the book. It should be the end of the book. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.